Okay, so welcome everyone. This is our 11th session, I think, for the PMP training class, or preparation. So we are going to cover a few things here today. And get my presentation in slideshow mode. Okay, so today we have a few topics that we're going to cover under doing the work. And the first one we're going to touch on is the manage communications. Then we'll spend some time on engage the stakeholders. And finally, we'll talk about the create the project artifacts. And if you want to ask questions during each of these different subtopics here, feel free to do so. Just ask that you remember to mute your phone when you're done with your questions. Okay, so here is the equivalent tasks, the ECO tasks that are for each of these topics. Managing communications is task 2.2. Engaging the stakeholders is task 2.4, and creating project artifacts is tasks 1.12, 2.9, and 3.1. Okay, so first topic, managing communications. So some of the enablers for handling the communications for your project. You need to analyze what are the communication needs of all your stakeholders. You need to understand if they need to know things monthly, do they need to know them weekly, do they need to know them at a high level, at a very detailed level, and how will you communicate to them? Will you communicate to them in an email, or will you send them out some sort of a status report that they read on their own? Will you have a meeting for them? And, possibly there's other types of updates that you might do. We'll talk about that in a little more detail as we get to that section. Also, you want to make sure that what you're communicating in your project information and the updates that you are giving is effective. And you also want to make sure that whatever communications that you are giving to your stakeholders, that it is understood, and that you get feedback from your stakeholders back to you so that you know that they understood your communications. So, like, for example, for me, some of my projects that I work on for my department, I make sure to say, when I'm forwarding an email about the status of the updates for the week, if you have any questions, please respond back. This way, if I remind them at the end of every email to do that, then it invites them to ask questions. And if they don't ask questions, it's pretty much a default of no questions means no feedback, means they're comfortable with the information that you provided. Okay, so some of the deliverables that you have when you're doing stakeholder communications, you want to create a communications management plan. You will actually do the communicating. You will compile a stakeholder register so you know who your stakeholders are and what form of communication they're going to get. You will also deliver the work itself, and if there's any changes to that work based upon any change requests or things that had been previously agreed upon in the scope or the business requirements, that you will also have change updates on those. And then finally, your last deliverable is making sure that all your project communications are constantly being updated. Okay, some of the tools that you may use to create your management plan for communicating is doing a stakeholder analysis. You will create and update your project communications plan. You will update the documents around what you're working from, and these are documents like your scope document, your project scope document, and your business requirements. Also, it's not incumbent upon you to do this, but you probably, in our company, you should update your architect solution. Also have your architect update it if there are changes that get made because of scope changes that were accepted or business requirements that needed updating. If that impacts what was originally documented as the architecture solution, you should probably make sure that that gets updated too. But that's on the architect to do, not you. And then you should also understand and practice the sender-receiver model to know that you're generating communications, and your receiver of those communications is understanding it. Okay, so what kind of communications are we talking about here? Well, first of all, you have to determine your internal and your external stakeholders, if you have any. Your internal stakeholders can be like those folks within our company who are part of our project. External stakeholders might be a vendor or third-party supplier who is working as part of your project to deliver something that is necessary for your project. So then a formal or an informal message, content, and format. You need to think about who your audience is for each of the different types of stakeholders you have, and are you going to, how are you going to be with the content and the format that you present to them? Will it be formal or informal? You should also consider the hierarchy of your communications, as in, is it a senior management group that is receiving your communication, or is it a group of your peers who are receiving your communication? Sometimes you want to make sure that you're more summarized when you're sending out information to your senior management team. They don't need all the details of the weeds of what you're doing. They just need a real high-level summary. But if you're going to be communicating like to your manager, or you're going to be communicating to your project team, then you'll probably want to be more detailed in your status or other communications that you're providing. Also, your project communications could be official or unofficial, and that's like in the form of, let's say, an annual report, or a report that's given to other governing bodies. And so those types of reports are very formal. They're very, I want to say this, like, it's almost like you're reading something that has been very well prepared and probably reviewed by an attorney, or reviewed by an auditor, or reviewed by an accountant or someone, if you're putting financials in it, to make sure that your communication is, quote, very official on behalf of the company. Obviously, an unofficial communication would be something that's not so formal. It would be, like maybe giving it to your project team or something like that. And then also, your project communications can be written or oral, and you should also think about your tone, inflection, and nonverbal gestures, because those are also influential in communicating with your stakeholders.
So there's a question here, Kathy, from Shelley Hoffman. I am always putting too much information for the executives. How do you know what and when to stop the info?
Well, from my perspective, I think about it as just like a one-page summary. Like, if they can just read it at a glance, like, on a screen. Like, you don't want to put, a lot of very complete sentences. You want to be more bullet pointed, and just trying to get across the highlights of what's happening, and not being so detail oriented and like preparing a complete sentence for everything you want to say. Like if you ask me, this screen right here that we're looking at, where there's bullets on what the topics for project communications and cover, this is like the format you'd want to use for what you wanted to give your senior management. It's very high level, it's very bulleted. It's easy to read. They can glance at it and get the gist of the message in one glance, basically. Because that might be all the time they have to spend on it. Does that help? And if anybody else has any better ideas, please, by all means, speak up.
It helps, but
Hey Sheila, I'm sorry, this is Jamel. I just got done with this task today and taking a first stab at it. And if you like, I can send you a draft of what I'm putting together because it's really helpful, and it's a framework that kind of shows your progress, your next steps, and your watch list. And I was told that this is a format that the senior executives like because it's a very, very high level. And to Kathy's point, it just shows bullet points, and but it kind of categorizes them in a status standpoint, and so that you can communicate exactly where you are. So I can send you that if you'd like to take a look at that, and maybe that might be helpful for you.
Yes, I would be greatly appreciative. I'm always, my project is large, and I'm always talking about the individual points of the project, and I don't think that that's ever what they want.
No, it's not.
They need it more high level, and I just keep giving them too detailed of information. So if you could provide that, that'd be great. I would greatly appreciate it.
Okay.
My suit ID is S as in Sam, B as in Bravo, 5652.
Okay, I'll give it to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamel.
Sure.
Natalie, yes, this session is being recorded. Okay, let's move on then. Your communications management plan. So this is one of your deliverables for under your communicating to stakeholders. And so here down the side, we talk about our stakeholders. And then across the top here, we have what's going to be our communication method for them. And then what is our frequency that we're going to communicate with them? What is their responsibility to what you're doing in the project? And then any notes that you want to make. And this is just for your, as a project manager, this is for you to know what it is that they're interested in so that you can be sure that you're delivering the right communications to them. So I really like this. I've never seen this little spreadsheet before. So I think it's a really good thing to use if you've never done this before. Even if you've done it 100 times and you're still like looking for a way to improve, this would probably be a good one. So I'm just going to take an example, for instance, between the client executive and the development team. So obviously the client executive is someone high in the senior management list, and their communication method is going to be through an executive steering committee. Then you're going to get their information, the executive steering committee is going to get the information from you on a monthly basis, and it's established for the first Wednesday of each month. This falls under the responsibility of the account manager, but really the account manager is going to get the information from you. So you as a project manager are going to probably be filtering all this into the account manager. And then you'll make sure that you review status, milestones met, earned value indicators, and key issues. That's sort of like what Jamel just said in her suggestion of what were the high-level bullets to put in there. Then if you look down further, and let's talk about the development team and how different that is. So the development team are your stakeholders also, and they're going to have a communication method with you that's in the form of status meetings. And these are going to happen every Friday at 11 a.m. Although if I were you, I would never make them on a Friday because too many people take Fridays off work, but that's just me. And then the responsibility of the meeting is you, the project manager, and so this, what they're suggesting is that make sure you get the input for the subsequent meetings that you'll be having with your client sponsor, and, you know, which is, again, reviewing project status, schedule, if there's any new change requests coming up and any issues that you need to call out. Okay, so I think that kind of illustrates the difference between some of the different stakeholders and their expectations for how you should communicate with them. Other things to consider in your communications management plan is what the stakeholders require, what the information to be communicated is, and also what language is to be used. I'm just going to say that if you've never done a global project before and you have other folks in other countries that don't speak English, this is like so key. In recent times, I've worked with a group that's called Most of World, who are in our business solutions side, and they have a lot of customers, a lot of folks in various countries across the world. And it never became more of a problem to me not to know Spanish until I started working in this group, because all my communications from the vendor who was working to fulfill some of our software needs would issue their stuff in Spanish because that was their native language. That's where they were from. They were from Spain, and so everything came out in Spanish. And some days I would have spent more time using that Translate Google thing to figure out what they were saying and some of the things that they sent us, because you don't speak Spanish, you don't know what it's saying, and you need to know. So in future, what I would have done differently had I been the one working with the vendor, I would have asked for everything in English. So sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, without us asking for it. Also, the reason for the distribution of the information, you know, is it required because you're needing to give status updates so that they know, you know, whether the project's falling behind, staying on track, or even ahead of schedule. Also, is the reason for the information because you're trying to, you know, give them a better picture of what's being delivered, what might not be delivered, and things like that. Obviously, we've already talked about the time frame and the frequency of the information that's being distributed. And also then, you know, letting folks know who's the person responsible for the communication, and is this person that's responsible also allowed to be releasing confidential information? And sometimes there's projects that we do in this company that are what we call NDA, which means you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement in order to work on the project. And so you obviously can't release confidential information to the whole world, or it wouldn't be confidential. So you have to, you know, understand who's going to receive your information, and, you know, if it's allowed to be released to them because of whatever the, I don't want to call it security clearance, but that's basically what it is, you know. Also, you want in your communications management plan to think about the method or technologies that you'll use to convey the information. Is it an email? Is it, you know, a text? Is it a phone call? Is it a status meeting? What have you? You'll also think about the time and the budget that you have to allocate in order to prepare your communications. You'll also want to talk about any escalation process that you need established so that issues that need visibility can be brought to light to those who need to know them. You'll also need to have in there what your method for updating your communications management plan is. It's always helpful to have a glossary of common terminology. If you use a lot of acronyms like we do in our business, it's really, really helpful to put that in there and define them. If you're going to provide flow charts to show how the information is going to flow. So let's say that you may be the one who's preparing the status report on a weekly basis, but yet it is the responsibility of the PMO to send these communications out to all the folks in IT who monitor, how many projects we have in flight at a certain time and how many are, on track, how many are behind, how many are ahead of schedule, et cetera. And then also thinking about any communication constraints due to regulations or policies. In the regulations, I honestly can't think of anything really off the top of my head that I could describe to you. A lot of regulations are public information, so I don't think there's a lot of constraints about those. But in our company, we have policies, obviously, like I said, about not disclosing certain information if it's a NDA status on the project itself. Okay, so here's a definition from PMBOK you have to know. The communication requirements analysis. This is the analytical technique to determine the information needs of the project stakeholders through interviews, workshops, study of lessons learned from previous projects, etc. So investigation that leads to a clear articulation of the stakeholders' communications needs is definitely a part of this analysis. This helps the project manager to make effective choices regarding the technologies to be recommended for communication, and it can take the form of a grid, questionnaire, or survey that documents the communications and technology requirements for each stakeholder. So like that grid that we looked at earlier is an example of one of those that I think is really nice for knowing what stakeholder needs what kind of communication and when. Okay, types of communications, obviously they can occur face-to-face, unless you're in a pandemic. Then they are video and voice conferencing, virtual meetings. They could be emails, they could be faxes, they could be an instant message or a queue, they could be text messages, they could be print media or other documents. It could be social media, or it could be a company website. Those last two, I've never had any experience with doing either of those for a project. So I don't know if anybody has, but to me, those kind of sound a little risky, but I get that they're in there. Yeah, Jay Patterson, fax, I know. Who would do that, right? Okay, another definition from PMBOK is the communication models. So a communication model is a description, analogy, or schematic used to represent how the communication process will be performed for the project. So I don't know if anybody's ever had to take a class in how to do effective communications. We actually have several that I've been through over the course of my years here at AT&T, but a lot of this is very the same over and over again. You have a message that's going to be transmitted by a sender. And so the sender is encoding this message. And then depending on how much noise is going around on the receiver's end, it depends on how much decoding they have to do in order to receive your message. Then, after they've received your message, you want them to acknowledge that they got your message, so you need some sort of confirmation that's sent back to you. And then also, if they're going to give you any feedback or response to your message, then they're going to encode on their side, and then after they form their feedback or their response, depending on how much noise is going around in your area of attention, you will decode the message and then acknowledge that you received it. So this is a very, I guess you would call it, basic communication pattern, or transmission, acknowledge, and then response or feedback. But I will just say one thing, as being a project manager for a long time and using email as my preferred method of communicating to people, I always try to acknowledge that I received someone's email, because it is very frustrating to know with some of our technology whether or not someone read your email. Even if it says that they read your email, it doesn't mean they really read your email. So what I always try to do when someone sends me an email is say something to the effect that, okay, I got your message, I understand, or I don't understand, but I'll look at it some more and I'll get back to you, or something. Just so that there's some kind of an acknowledgement that you knew that that person read your email. And then I try to be courteous on the other side and do the same for them. Without that, sometimes you're just lost as to whether or not anybody has read what you sent. And if they haven't read it and they haven't responded to it, chances are something's not right. And your message has not, either the transmission has not been acknowledged or has not even occurred. Pick up the phone if you're in an email situation, you know, or if it's something where you can text them or whatever, just so you can get an immediate understanding of whether or not they heard you. And I feel like that's really important to do, a second method of communication in that situation, because you don't want to assume, because you know what that does to you. Just saying. A communication method is a systematic procedure, technique, or process that is used to transfer information among project stakeholders. And this should not be just a push of information out or a pull of information to someone, but more on the interactive style. You want to know, like I said before in the other thing, that you sent something out, they acknowledged that they read it, they understood it, and then you can move forward. If you didn't ask any questions or you didn't need to know something in the message that you sent to them, you can make that agreement of the default of no response means they have no questions. But I would not go into a project with a new stakeholder if you don't know that the default response of no feedback means they understood it, because they could be way out on some other plane of understanding from you, and unless you have some sort of conversation about it, you won't know. And then later down, down the line in the project life cycle, it could become a problem. So I would really strongly recommend that until you know your stakeholders really well, that you make sure that you have that basic understanding for each other of responding. Okay, so feedback. This is communication is a two-way street, and feedback can be positive when the message is received and understood as the sender intended. Feedback can be negative if the receiver does not understand what the sender intended. And again, here's that thing about no feedback provides an implicit acceptance of the message by the receiver. And effective feedback should be clear, specific, and offered in a timely manner. So I just want to kind of give an example about feedback can be negative if the receiver does not understand what the sender intended. It can blow up your project. If there's something that you thought you understood about requirements, let's say, and your stakeholder gave you some requirements, and then you were going down this path of delivering these requirements, and then all of a sudden you get a question from someone about, well, I looked at this in this perspective, and it has an entirely different meaning than what you're understanding it to mean. And that can happen. And honestly, I've had that happen in my career with certain people, and they always seem to have a different level of understanding than what I intended for them to do. So in those cases, I strongly recommend that you just get into the habit of whatever you present to them, you present to them on the phone at the best. I mean, at the minimum. If you could do it face-to-face, that's probably even better. But make sure that at least, because in email, sometimes they can't get your tone or they can't hear those nonverbal cues, and so it's much harder for them to get your intended message. And so by having a conversation with them, a verbal conversation, it makes it that much easier to confirm that they did get what you intended for them to understand. Okay, so some guidelines to effectively manage your communication throughout the project. Gather and distribute contact information for all involved parties. And you can build distribution lists once you know who all your parties are, so you're sure that everybody gets the right information. Understand the communication needs of your project stakeholders. As a rule of thumb, the project team members require more detail on a more frequent basis, and senior management typically requires summary information on a less frequent basis. You should analyze the value to the project for providing information. You don't have to tell everybody every last little detail if it doesn't add value to your project, but you definitely want to make sure that you hit, the major points, and don't forget to say anything in that respect. And that means good news and bad news, by the way. I hate giving bad news to my senior management, but I've learned my lesson the hard way. It's better to tell them that right up front as soon as you know about it, than to, let it be a surprise to them and hear it from somebody else. Also, evaluate any constraints and assumptions to determine their possible impact on your communication planning. Determine the appropriate communications technologies to use for communicating project information. Like, should it be an email? Should it be a fax? Should it be a face-to-face meeting? Make sure your communications management plan includes all your key elements that we've already been through. Integrate the communications management plan into your overall project plan, and distribute the plan to your project stakeholders so they know what to expect from you. A lot of times, people are so busy, and you might not be the only project manager they're working with for projects, so it's definitely helpful for them to know what your plan is so that they know when to expect the information from you. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this topic on planning your communications and managing that. Does anybody have any questions or anything before we move on? All right, we're going to keep going. Okay, our next topic is about engaging your stakeholders. Just for your reference, the enablers of analyze stakeholders map to the 2.4.1 task. The categorize stakeholders maps to the 2.4.2. Engage stakeholders by category is mapping to 2.4.3. And develop, execute, and validate a strategy for stakeholder engagement is mapped to the task of 2.4.4. Okay, so some of the deliverables that get created when you're managing your stakeholders. One is to create the stakeholder register. Another is to keep it updated. The third is a stakeholder engagement plan. And the last one is assess the work performance information that you're going to share with your stakeholders. Some of the tools that you're going to use to make these deliverables happen could be your organization process assets, expert judgment, having meetings, creating a power or influence versus impact grid. You're going to use some of your really good interpersonal skills, management skills, and then, of course, your stakeholder register. Okay, there are different categories of stakeholders, and some that you might want to, think about that are the basic ones would be your sponsors, customers, and users. If, in my example, I work in the tax department, and so a lot of my users are my peers in the tax department. We have a lot going on in the tax world, so we have a lot of different groups. I got to make sure all of them that need to know are included in my projects. Also, I might have some other partners in the organization, like a lot of times the things that we do to tax the customer on the invoice affects what happens from a revenue perspective. So I want to make sure I'm in touch with the revenue accounting people, because sometimes our project might affect some things that they're doing, and we want to, have synergies and not spend too much money on something, that they're doing and we're doing. We don't want to duplicate efforts. So it's always good to check in with, them when I'm doing a project to make sure that they're aware of what we're doing and does it have any effect on them. Another type of category of stakeholder you could have is a seller. We have a lot of sellers in our world, obviously, with the distribution points we have. Business partners, we already kind of talked about. Organizational groups, functional managers, and then other stakeholders might be there's a vendor that's involved in your project to do some work outside of what your IT department is doing for you. They would be considered another stakeholder. Okay, your stakeholder engagement strategy. You should develop a strategy to involve each project stakeholder based on needs, expectations, interests, and potential impact on the project. The strategy can be used to effectively involve stakeholders throughout the life cycle of the project. It enables the right level of management to the number of stakeholders. It enables development of appropriate management strategies to engage stakeholders, and it will create and also help you maintain the relationships between the project team and the stakeholders. Another PMBOK term here to learn is the Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix. And this is a matrix that compares current and desired stakeholder engagement levels. So let's say you have some stakeholders over here, and your first stakeholder is someone on your team. And your second stakeholder is someone who is like your sponsor of your project. And your third stakeholder is someone from someone from the vendor who is also working on your project. So stakeholder one, being someone on your team, if right now they're unaware that your project is happening, but you really need them because the work you're doing is going to affect them once it's complete, then you need to move them from their current engagement level of unaware to a supportive role, or maybe even a leading role, or engagement level. So, you're just trying to figure out where you are at this point in time. With your stakeholder number 2, who is client sponsor, well, if they're unaware, then there's a big problem, but hopefully they are aware. And if they're neutral right now about this project, then that's kind of not good. You got to get them moved into being supportive. So you definitely have to do some work on this for them. And then stakeholder 3 being your vendor who's collaborating with you to get a solution, they definitely should not be unaware. Let's say they're in the supportive role right now, but you'd really like them to do some taking the lead on certain things, and so you want to move them into more of a leading role than the supportive role. So that's basically what this matrix is saying is, where are you right now at this point in time? Okay, so some guidelines to develop, execute, and validate a strategy for stakeholder engagement. Definitely review your project management plan. Review who your stakeholders are. You can review the EEF for your enterprise. Review the organizational process assets for your enterprise. Use tools and techniques such as expert judgment. And if you don't know, then you should find people that do and ask them for their opinion. Hold meetings with your experts and also with your project team, because your project team definitely probably can weigh in on who some of the stakeholders might be that you're not aware of. Use analytical techniques to classify the level of engagement for your stakeholders, and then document your stakeholder engagement plan. And that's about all we have under stakeholder, creating stakeholder registers and engaging your stakeholders. Any questions, comments? Okay, we're going to keep going. I'm just going to say that this is the solution for one of the activities that you're going to do on your own. So I think you all can download these materials, right, so you can be aware that the solution is out there, but try not to look at it before you do the actual work. Okay, now my last topic for today is about creating project artifacts. And the enablers for here, determine the requirements for managing project artifacts, can refer to 2.12.1. Validate that the project information is kept up to date and accessible is in section 2.12.2. And continually assess effectiveness of the management of the project artifacts. And that can be referred to in section 2.12.3. One thing I just want to say about project artifacts, there are some in our company that are what I would consider like a necessity. Like, you're not going to be able to finish your project if you didn't do these artifacts. And theoretically, you shouldn't do certain artifacts before other ones are created. And hopefully, by this point in time, you have a good working understanding of that through all the classes and all the work experience that you've had in project management. But I just want to say that some of the artifacts are very necessary in a large, complex project. And some of the artifacts are not as necessary when you're doing smaller projects that are more simple. And so you need to be, like, aware, like, I don't know, sometimes I feel like, you know, there's so many artifacts out there that should be created, but yet, if that's all you did, you would never have a successful project. And just because you completed and managed to get them all done doesn't mean that your project's a success. So you want to, like, continually, this last bullet here is what I'm trying to harp on, continually assess the effectiveness of the management of the project artifacts. Because if some of them are, you know, not going to be useful or helpful through the life cycle of the project, and then you should argue that, and you should make a case for why you should or shouldn't do it with whomever is guiding you for your project, be that your sponsor, your PMO, or what have you. And so they're not really going to share any specific deliverables with you, but honestly, there's a whole bunch out there that you have to think about. So the PMBOK definition of a project artifact says that any document related to the management of a project. The project team will create and maintain many artifacts during the life of the project to allow reconstruction of the history of the project and to benefit other projects. And these artifacts should be living documents and be updated to reflect changes in project requirements and scope. So examples of these, obviously, is the project scope document, your business requirements, your system requirements. These are all artifacts. These are all living documents. And through the entire life cycle of the project, those documents should be kept being updated in order to document the key decisions or key requirements of your project that maybe at the very beginning of your project weren't there. Because, like it says, if you have to go back in history to look at something that happened in a project so that a project that comes after that can be worked on and leverages what the work was in this project, it's really, really helpful if everybody has done their due diligence and kept those documents updated. And for me, in this company, I've noticed that recently because some things that were implemented in a certain way from a tax perspective, they might get audited, and the audit might not happen for like 5 years. And so let's say we started billing a tax in the biller, and 5 years later, we got audited for the billing of that tax. And they're challenging us on, you know, whether this type of charge was taxable or not taxable, and what was the reasoning behind whether we did it or not. All that kind of information is very helpful to have to support the audit. So being able to go back to those artifacts and show those to an auditor really helps at that time, because, you know, the project's gone and done. The people who probably worked on it are gone out of, you know, the company. And so, you know, having these artifacts is really helpful. Okay, so project artifacts could include acceptance criteria, assumptions, business case, change requests, constraints, lessons learned, minutes of status meetings, a project charter, slide decks, requirements, a scope baseline, which means to say that at a certain point in time, you've agreed that this is the scope of your project, and so you establish that as the baseline, and anything that moves forward from that could be a change, and therefore would have to go through a change request process. And then any subsidiary project management plans that get generated. In addition to your project, if you have agile projects, they have a unique set of artifacts, and these are called the product backlog, the product increment, the product roadmap, a product vision statement, a release plan, and a sprint backlog. I saw a question pop up, but I'm in the slideshow. Can somebody tell me what question was in the chat? I didn't get to see it all.
What are the most common artifacts reviewed from previous projects to help with current projects?
Definitely lessons learned. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on. Okay, sorry. I would say definitely that your lessons learned. I would also say that your scope baseline and your requirements are helpful as well. Those things are, at least for me, things that I would say that are very helpful for your next project.
Kathy,
I don't know if anybody has any other comments about the list.
Yeah, Kathy, this is Heather. One of the things I don't see, which could be helpful, is like a project roster, understanding who did what.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Kathy, this is Jay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Kathy, I'm sorry. I dropped accidentally when I asked that question in chat, and I did not hear your answer. Would you mind just repeating what your answer was? By the time I got in, I think you just finished. Go.
Oh, sure. What I was saying for me would be, what were my lessons learned from the previous project? What were the requirements in the previous project? And what was the scope baseline for the previous project?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And for technology-related physical projects, I always use slide decks that show network flow, like what we're doing as far as the plan and the flow of how things are moving.
Thank
Good
you.
point. And then if you're working on your Agile project, I would say that the product backlog is very helpful, because with Agile projects, obviously, the product backlog is the one thing that keeps moving from increment to increment. And so knowing what you did in that particular increment is very helpful for the future and the product backlog. Okay. Another term from PMBOK is the configuration management. And this is a tool that's used to manage changes to a product or service being produced, as well as changes to any project documents. Configuration management is used to control product iterations, ensure that product specifications are current, and controls the steps for reviewing and approving product prototypes, testing standards, and drawings or blueprints. From my perspective, as far as for project documents, my configuration management is manual because it's just all about numbering things 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or using the dates that you change things on, like your project documents updated on August 4th, updated on August 12th, updated on August 31st. That's how I keep track of my project documents, but others have other standards that they might use. When it comes to producing a product or a service, like software, for instance, there are actual configuration management tools that can be used to control iterations of your software and making sure that what's in each version of your software is, got the, there's a, what do I want to call it? Like a table of contents which says, these 3 items are included in this version, or, these 4 things are included in the next version. Okay, and then a configuration management system is a collection of procedures used to track project artifacts and monitor and control changes to these artifacts. So, again, a system can be manual. Like I said, it can be something that you do manually, or it could be a tool that you have that helps you with that. Okay, version control. And PMBOK's definition is a system that records changes to a file in a way that allows you to retrieve previous changes made to it. Each time the file is updated, it is automatically saved and then given a new version number. The version control system can contain a date timestamp and the name of the user who made the changes, thus providing a digital paper trail of the document's history. And a robust project management system will contain version control for important artifacts, such as the project management plan, the subsidiary project management plans, the scope, and other documents. So one type of system that we're using in the company, I do a lot of work with IBM, and they use JIRA, and that's a system where everybody's features, user stories, capabilities, acceptance criteria, and probably even more that I don't know about because that's just what I see from my PM role on the project. All those artifacts are in the system, and you can generate these artifacts and look at them online, or I think they can be exported also, so that you can see you know, what your features are, what you're mapping to for a user story, what you're breaking it down to for a program increment, which ones are going to be worked on in which increment, and so forth, and then even down to the iteration. So that's a very robust project management tool that's out there right now. I haven't worked with some of the other ones that are out there. I don't know if anybody else has any experience with some of the others. Okay. So then one of the other things about your project artifacts is the storage and the distribution of those artifacts. Your artifacts should be stored in a location that is accessible to the people who use them. The system should be manageable given the complexity of the project. It should not be a cumbersome system that is better suited for a large project. A cloud-based document storage and retrieval systems are appropriate for larger projects, especially where team members are geographically distributed. Features of off-the-shelf systems might include built-in version control, document checkout and check-in, user-based document security, automatic email notification to specified users when a document is created or edited, and the system chosen to distribute the project artifacts should also be based on the size and complexity of the project. So with these IBM projects, they're always large, they're always complex, and using JIRA to locate or to house all of your artifacts is a pretty good plan. Also, in the company, we have something called Bolt, which some of you may be familiar with or know it as Prism, but that's where a lot of project artifacts get stored in a section of that system. And then people can you know, refer and access those documents wherever you are. It's intended for geographical distribution. Okay, and then project artifact management. An effective archive management system includes these provisions. There's a way to produce and control documents without unnecessary administrative overhead. There are standardized formats and templates. There's a structured process for the review and approval of documents. There's version control and security, and there's timely distribution of documents. Okay, guidelines to continually assess the effectiveness of management of project artifacts. Use an appropriate degree of configuration management for your project. Follow any organizational procedures regarding project management documentation, develop an archive management system that is of appropriate size and complexity for your project. Pay particular attention to these issues: the types of documents needed and their purpose, templates to facilitate document creation, authors, reviewers, and approvers of documents, and then implement version control of your documents so you could reconstruct those changes and revert to an earlier version if necessary. There's something in here that they're not addressing that our company addresses, and I just want to make mention of it because in my world in tax it's really important, and that's the RIM retention policy. You know, RIM is the Records Information Management process that we have in place in our company. And in the tax department specifically, we have tons of documents, obviously, that are produced, not just related to projects, but related to tax returns and notices from taxing authorities and legislation that we have to follow and all kinds of documents. So, and also a lot of times, you know, what we've remitted that we've collected from our customers in the form of taxes is subject to an audit. So we have set guidelines on the RIM retention policies for tax that sometimes are different than what I would call the average user in the company has. So because I think I mentioned earlier that an audit could happen 5 years after the fact of when something is being billed from a tax perspective, we have to retain documents for up to 10 years. And so our documentation plans have to be a little bit more structured, and we have to be sure that certain documents are retained for, you know, that life cycle of 10 years. And sometimes that affects what some of our reporting systems do because they have to do that as well. So if you are working on a project that's related to tax, I'm just saying, you may never have this happen to you, but just check on that RIM retention thing, because if they have, you know, if they need to keep things for longer than what the average, you know, retention policy is, then you need to be aware of that for your artifacts so that you kept them in place for what might be necessary because of an audit. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of this topic on creating project artifacts. I'm not going to go through this list. I'm pretty sure that we've covered all of these between Monday session and today's session as far as accomplishing these goals. And these are, I don't know if your answers would change from Monday if you thought about these questions, but is there any aspects of executing the project plan that you have found to be the most challenging? Or are there any tools that you will use to effectively execute projects in the future? Have I lost everybody? Everybody just wants to end the day.
We're still here.
Yep, still here.
Yeah, we're here.
All right. Okay, well, if nobody wants to speak up, that's okay. I'm going to stop the recording, though.